who recently retired as the Additional Chief Secretary to Chief Minister Andhra Pradesh. Earlier, he was the Chairman and Managing Director of Rural Electrification Corporation. His other roles include, serving as the Principal Finance Secretary and as Principal Secretary, Department of Health and Family Welfare. And he spent a good 13 years working for multinational development international organizations like Fund for Agricultural Development and United Nations. With that, welcome to IA Talks, sir. It's good to have you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for this opportunity.
Right. So, sir, I mean, let's begin with, your interesting journey. You were in Vellore, studying medicine. You were a gold medalist in medicine. From that to becoming a civil servant, why did you make that, choice of moving into civil services, back then? And this is, I believe, way back in 1980s. So, can you just shed light on, what was your motivation?
Thank you and good evening to everyone. Very, very happy new year. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. Especially want to congratulate you, Mayur, Tarun, and all your team for the wonderful work that you've been doing. And above all, thanks for inviting me to follow illustrious speakers who had come before me. I hope that I have something to contribute, which would be of use to everyone. Going back to myself, I mean, I've been always been, a hardworking student, and my mother said that one day I must win the Nobel Prize, and I've disappointed her because that the bar was just too high, and I uh, entered Vellore as one of the open candidates because Vellore used to take very few students. And Vellore has CMC is one of the outstanding educational institutions for training doctors because it had a very strong emphasis on scientific excellence at the same time a very strong public health community outreach orientation. So it was a best mix of best of both worlds. In fact, we needed to spend 3 to 4 weeks every year in a village, kind of understanding the social and economic contributors of nutrition, healthcare, do a project and follow up the same set of families for a period of time. And that had given me a very different insight. And then if you see, actually, I graduated in 83 and with few gold medals from the University of Madras. Those days it was Madras University. But those were also the days of extraordinary sense of idealism. I mean, a desire to transform the world. And then I came across this great quote, and I'm quoting, I'm remembering it after a long time. But this is by Mazzini, the father of perhaps modern Italy. And Mazzini had said so eloquently that every life is a mission. Religion, science, and philosophy may be at variance on various issues, but they all ultimately mean that every life and every existence has a meaning. Now, this somehow really had driven me, and the second was the whole issue of the social movements of the 70s, the idealism to transform the universe. Now, I had this curious combination of really in love with medicine because medicine is education is such an extraordinary education because it really teaches you the scientific method of learning about yourself, about others, and also to contribute to this whole universe of healing. But when I sat down, I actually struggled with myself for a year. I mean, it was not many doctors, of course, these days join the IAS, and many of them do so because either because they are disenchanted with medical education or they see that IAS wields a lot of power. Now, these two things never really crossed my mind. And it was really to find a meaning in life. I mean, what would I do if I were a doctor? In those days, cardiothoracic surgeon was the ultimate sort of goal of good medical students or a cardiologist. Now, let's say I became a cardiologist and in my life of 50, 40 years of productive professional life, and then I weighed this with, being in public service, and I thought I should give a try, and then I'm here. I joined in 85 and 84. When I wrote the exam, I met with an accident in the middle of the exams, and I had to be hospitalized and bedridden for a long time. So in 83 in November, I had this accident, so I had to write the exam again, 84, and then I joined the civil service in 85. So that's how I made this big transition. And for me, it had always, my parents, my friends were completely thought I had gone crazy in terms of becoming the, but that's how my journey started in 85 with the civil service.
Right. In fact, if I recollect this correctly, sir, till I think early 80s, doctors were not allowed to sort of sit for civil services. It was only during that time. I mean, given your training in medicine, I mean, did that help you in any way during your civil services career? Especially, did you think that you had a very different perspective given your training in medicine, given that you spent, so many years working with, patients and so on and so forth in hospitals? Did that ever come across as a distinct advantage?
In 80s, actually till 1980, the doctors were not qualified to appear for the civil services unless they already had a BSc degree or BA degree. MBBS was not qualifying. And 80, when the new system was introduced following Kothari Commission recommendations, it simply said any graduate could appear for civil services. So which meant also the MBBS, but the medical subjects were not offered. I mean, they were not optionals. One could not take medicine as an optional as is being done today. I mean, I think this was introduced much later, as far as I know. And then so I had to take psychology and history for my exam. And I must say that what really helped me is the ability to study hard and the ability to quickly grasp, ingest, remember, and retrieve. So that information. The second is this entire idea of scientific methodology. I mean, the approach, organized thought process and organized presentation. That's a huge advantage in terms of medical education. I mean, the structure of education per se, but not so much the content wise. I don't believe that I had benefited, but the process of learning, the very scientific methodology has been one of those great um, additions to my own learning process.
Right. So, sir, I mean, some of your early postings were possibly in some of the toughest regions, Adilabad, Karimnagar. They're all conflict-affected zones. A lot of Naxalism back then, possibly even now. And going in as a young civil servant, actually representing the government, where clearly, I mean, there is a sentiment against the government, or possibly, not in favor. How do you then sort of drive a development agenda in those circumstances?
Oh, thank you. Actually, it had been both a mix of conscious choice, and because when everyone wanted to work in urban areas, everybody wanted to be sub-collector of Vijayawada or Tenali. Those days, Narsipatnam, these were considered the important postings, Gudur in Nellore district or Tirupati. I really opted to go to tribal areas to work. I mean, I think it was also because the people with whom I was interacting those days, people like Mr. Shankar, I mean, and Mr. MBPC Sastry, Mr. Gopal Rao, to mention some of my seniors, Mr. Madhurao, Mr. Yugandhar, some of these stalwarts of civil servants who really had made that critical difference to people. And then I also thought it would be a very big challenge. And that's how I first went as assistant collector to Mehboob Nagar, then Warangal, then Adilabad. And then I went to East Godavari, Rapchodoram as project officer ITDA. Then came back as joint collector Karimnagar, then went as district development officer Mehboob Nagar. And then, so almost all my field postings, other than a brief posting in Vizag and in Chittoor for a year, almost about 10 long years I spent in the tribal areas and also Naxal affected areas. And it was a, I mean, to me, I mean, that's been a blessing. I learned the art and science of development practice, the participatory development, the people's issues at the feet of the people who are there. I'm grateful ever, because had I not worked in those areas, I would have never learned the real art of development management. I mean, in the sense, the ability to sit with people, to listen to them, to hear their stories, to learn from them, and at the same time, I mean, what does really a civil servant do? Are those days what we were doing? I mean, you had people with multiple problems. I mean, lands not settled. They had the titles, but they had no land, or the lands are underdeveloped, or there's a people who are extracting money from the revenue department or forest department. So these were constant tussle between the people and the government. And rather than, I mean, notwithstanding all the other issues, and that is where really the Naxals perfectly seamlessly fitted in. And the mainstream political parties had actually withdrawn from the system. So it's very interesting. In a way, you had a political vacuum, and you also had this conflict. It's no reflection on any of the officers. They were trying their best. But what happens is, unless you really go down and then spend value time with people, for a week together, I never used to come back to office. I used to sleep under a tree, have hold meetings with the community, try to go down to the fields, understand what the problems were, go to the next village. So it used to be one continuum of moving from a village to village. And then that I mean, I must also confess, I mean, now I'm past the prime, so I can confess, looking back, I mean, I had a very good support from the Naxal groups those days. I mean, in a way, they understood that I was well intentioned. They understood that I was not an ivory tower civil servant. They understood I was working for I was genuinely trying to find solutions to the problems of the people. And that really helped me in a way. So, in a way, if you look at the platform, you didn't have a political establishment operating there, unlike any other place in those areas. So broadly, I could do whatever I really could do, good or bad. And second was, even the senior officials hardly ever used to come. So in that sense, I didn't have this constant pressure of somebody breathing down my neck. And the third was that the people reacted so positively, and I had an outstanding team. I mean, people usually complain that revenue officials are extractive, they don't work, they take bribes. But I've had all my life an extremely different experience of very charged, empowered teams who had very clear idea of what they needed to do, very defined deliverables, and very performance driven. And phenomenal work was done, I must say. I mean, I still look back on my field work and say that I had learned as much as I had given. And the best opportunity was that as a sub collector or as a project officer, we could draw upon the resources that are available in outside world. I mean, in whether it is UNICEF or it's the World Bank officials or a research institute or a medical college hospital. So you really bring in those different resources for the use of the people. So many of those which have now become mainstream and as accepted as normal ingredients of development, in a way, were innovated with the help of the people. I mean, whether it was village health volunteers, which has now become the mainstream in those days. Second is the fixed day mobile health services, or the tuberculosis patients. What do you do for them? The directly administered um, the medication because of poor comp. No, these were some of those. And then the extension workers, community managed extension programs, and community ownership on the development programs, village settlement of lands, or infrastructure creation, and low cost check dams, watershed management programs. Now, grain banks, the small grain banks, which really provided that nutrition security. all these, and then small microcredit operations, which started very early in 80s and then really gained momentum in 90s and thereafter. All these, in a way, were not my creation or my government's creation. They came up from the people. These were solutions which people found. And I think some of the extraordinary work, and not by me alone, many of my colleagues, many of my seniors and juniors have continued the trend in tribal areas. So when I look back and I go back, I see a lot has happened. Of course, I mean, the development never stops. It's a long drawn process. So that way I feel, unlike many other IS officers, I've been fortunate to really go to those areas where nobody wanted to go, because those days when I went to my first posting, I didn't have an office, I didn't have a staff, I didn't have a vehicle, I didn't have a whole house to stay. So I started from there, and then of course, I mean, uh,
Right. Sir, I mean, deviating slightly, but I mean, sticking to the topic, I think, few ISO officers actually got kidnapped during that time in Andhra Pradesh, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, so, I mean, given any interesting anecdotes that you could share, I mean, of, interacting or, like you said, I mean, dealing with Naxal, given there was such a huge vacuum, I mean, in terms of just, political participation or people participation.
I was not kidnapped. I mean, I was not among those group that was kidnapped. I went to Rampachodapuram after the kidnapping of the 6 IS officers took place. I mean, the IS officers, 6 of them, very senior officers, they went in all good faith inside, and they went without security, and then they were kidnapped and they had to be swapped with 4 very leading Naxalites, of some of them whom died subsequently, but one of them is today is really the topmost man in the Maoist Communist Party. So, but and I was posted because all those officers were moved out of East Godavari, and I was posted as project officer ITDA in Rampachodapuram soon after. So when I reached there, maybe I'll just take a couple of minutes just to see what the situation, just to recall what the situation was when I went there. The first thing was there was no officer that remained there. Every government employee had abandoned the work post and had scooted to plain areas. So there was nobody. Number two was that there was a general consternation and scare that if the principal secretary of the government can, and men who were, these were all men and women who were known to be extremely committed to tribal development, if they could be kidnapped, what is the fate of the lesser mortals? And the third one was, so which basically meant the whole place was paralyzed. There was nobody that was moving. The whole place was paralyzed. And then to make matters worse, there was a directive from the government that IAS officers could not leave their home or office and travel anywhere without a full-fledged security, which meant 2 armed personal security officers carrying AK-47s. So this basically meant that you could go nowhere because the security officers really could not protect you. It was, I had to protect my security officers. So I had a choice between, what it basically meant was that you become a prisoner of the circumstances. And if you don't go out, nothing happens in these areas. So that is how I started. And then I gradually built a team, and then through some contacts I opened up communication with the Naxal groups, and I had a face-to-face meeting and said, we need to really work out a working arrangement. And then we had a working protocol with them, and then I started reconnecting with people. We organized the communities, we organized the village volunteers, village health workers, the teachers, the schools, and we reconfigured the school system completely altogether. We organized these school complexes, started midday meals, changed the academic calendar to suit the local agriculture calendar as well as the weekly calendar. So we never used to have Sunday holidays. Instead, we used to have a Shandy Day holiday. So things like that, little changes, but which have had a great impact. But this honeymoon lasted for an year, I mean, which is fairly good enough. And then the Naxals one fine morning decided to kidnap the district education officer. When I told him to go, and we used to have these Saturday meetings in different location of these residential schools, and then when the DEO was kidnapped, and the teachers, and there are thousands of them, and their largest workforce, as you know, there was a complete scare, and yeah, then they thought it's back to basics. And so it was very interesting. I mean, interesting and also quite challenging, because on one side, to manage the police officials, paramilitary forces, and also the Naxals. So finally we retrieved back the DEO, but we had to exchange the daughter of one of those couple who was released earlier as swap for the others. So it was a constant effort to find an equilibrium where you could continue to work. But it is an extraordinary challenge. I learned a lot. I learned a lot as to how to work in the conflict areas.
Right. In fact, I mean, keeping with this theme, in your international stint as well, sir, you ended up actually working in a lot of conflict areas again, whether it was in Africa, East Timor, and other places. So, how do you contrast, let's say, being part of the state versus being part of an international organization, and going in a so-called neutral, let's say, position, and trying to undertake a development agenda? Did you see a lot of contrast between these two roles?
No, I think that's a very interesting question. Actually, I mean, let me first begin by saying the very beginning is that, I mean, in a way, my international career started with my work in the tribal area. So I'm grateful for that. I mean, in the sense that had it not been for that experience, I think as an IAS officer, I would never have been taken into any international organizations, because the traditional image of an IAS officer is he's command and control. He doesn't have any listening skills. He talks all the time. He knows everything. And he is not a team player. And they don't have a particularly a technical skills in terms of analytical abilities. And then poor writing skills. This is the broad image of an IAS officer. So if I tell anybody in the international organizations that I'm an IAS officer, they're unlikely to hire me, because and it is essentially because of my long work in the tribal areas, where there were several projects that germinated from the examples that we tested with International Fund for Agriculture Development, with UNICEF, with the World Bank, which became mainstream and subsequently actually international. I think that was one of those reasons that gave me an opening into the international civil service. I mean, particularly with International Fund for Agriculture Development, later diversified into United Nations, and shortly with the United Nations Population Fund and the World Bank. Now, just to put it in a perspective, I perhaps was one of those few people who have had an opportunity to work across the world in all the trouble spots, and at the peak of this. And it's not because it was not by design, unlike my tribal career in the IAS or Naxal career. It was by default, by accident, I mean, or a coincidence. So when I started working in the Asia Pacific office, in India, I used to manage several projects. I mean, that included the tribal projects in Andhra, that included the tribal development project in Odisha. And then I went to help with the organizing the Northeast project. And in 90s, the Northeast India was still a hotbed of insurgency. It still is. And in fact, our first project was in Ukrul district, where the Tangkul Muiwa of the Ukrul, his home village is where we actually started in a way as NSCN's hotbed. So because I thought that's a message that we send, that we are committed and we were neutral. We really want to go to those areas which the government of India or the state governments were not going. Now in India, that was then. I used to work in Nepal in the Maoist affected areas. In Bangladesh, of course, I mean, including the Chakma areas, because that was the first project after there was a settlement between the Bangladesh government and Chakma government. And Nepal, I continued even, actually I was present in Kathmandu when the Maoists and the government signed the agreement and the Maoists surfaced. Now, of course, Mr. Prachanda had been prime minister and is part of the government. And then then in Bhutan, in the southern part where there was a Nepali minority population, Sri Lanka in Jaffna. So, it goes on and on in Myanmar, in Laos, in the northern Laos, in Indonesia, in the West Timor, East Timor combination, and Mindanao in Philippines. So this is Asia Pacific in 5 years working in these areas. I mean, there are two, three important differences. One difference, of course, is you don't know really the grassroots terrain because you go once in a while, there's an ongoing project there, you come back. So a lot depends on the project management capabilities themselves rather than what we get to do. But as somebody from a United Nations entity, we certainly had the acceptance from the people that we brought a neutral situation. And many a time we followed the peace, or we were the only ones who were working. I mean, I remember in Jaffna, there was nobody else other than the United Nations operations there. So similarly, we were one of the first to get into Mindanao when the Mindanao Moro Liberation Front laid down their arms and then entered the mainstream. And they became part of the development process in southern Philippines. So I have had the opportunity of really being at the place. And the big lesson I learned was it needs a painstaking work. Number two is it needs a statesman to really bring those so-called insurgents or those who are, I mean, if your own citizens who are working against, who are fighting against your armed forces or paramilitary forces, there must be some reason. There must be a serious grievance that one is not able to, one is the governance systems are not addressing. So I then later, of course, I mean, I had an opportunity to work in Iraq and Palestine. Then I had almost a 2 year stint in Afghanistan. Then I went in Somalia, Sudan. Now, I mean, in all these things I believe have changed after 2003. 2003, when the United Nations failed to stop the war against the American-led coalition of the so-called League, that was the time when actually the tide turned. Till such time, the United Nations, wherever I went, or a multilateral organization, was a respected entity. The Iraq War, the feeling gained ground that United Nations had compromised. And I think that the turning point was August 18th, 2003, when the Canal Hotel, where the United Nations headquarters was based, and in which Sergio de Mello, the United Nations representative, was blown away. In fact, I was supposed to have been there on that day for that meeting. And since I could not get security clearance in Amman in Jordan, I could not be present. Otherwise, maybe we would not be talking to each other today. I've been fortunate in that sense of working through these places, but I've learned a lot.
Thank you so much, sir. And coming back to your role as the principal finance secretary, I mean, you had the opportunity to now, sort of work across departments and see, essentially work on a deficit budget. Interestingly, I mean, we had our previous guest talk about how the Indian government actually has, more than 400 welfare programs, DBT programs. I think add to that, a lot of state welfare programs as well. There's been increasingly this talk of actually trying to converge all of them. What are some of the administrative challenges and as well as political, let's say, challenges in trying to do this, in trying to actually bring convergence on all of these, and try to, especially as a practitioner, given that as a finance secretary, you had to deal with budgets of every department. What's your view and your opinion on this?
Oh, thank you. I will try to be brief. I mean, I hope I'm not taking too much time, but because each one of these are long experiences. I mean, experiences of, and I was finance secretary for nearly 5 long years, and 2.5 years before the state was divided, and 2.5 years after the state was divided as to the Andhra state. And then I was also in charge of the state bifurcation. I was the principal secretary in charge during the bifurcation, which gave me, actually that gave me a much deeper insight about all the different departments, the functions, functionaries, their operational space. And the finance actually department plays, or the finance secretaries play an extremely important role in terms of not only determining the priorities or sectoral priorities and facilitating this negotiation between the political executive and the bureaucracy and real needs of the people at the grassroots level. And second is the sectoral priorities, and how do you really ensure that there is a minimize the leakage, maximize impact, and ensure that every single rupee that you take it really reaches the people, while ensuring that the financial propriety is maintained, and also your overall fiscal framework is managed efficiently, so that you don't fall into a debt trap. You continue to function. So it is an extremely challenging opportunity. Not people outside the government may not even know how important this entire work is, because you're really managing the public finances at the end of the day, uh, or public finances. Every rupee that comes into the public account is really something that is coming from the people, or you're borrowing to the extent that the finance commissions permit you to borrow. That borrowing space is also limited. But the politicians, if you and I were political leaders, we would like to do everything that is possible. And they also would like to make the people believe that this money is there, coming from their pocket. So I'm not part of the government, I can be a lot more free. Now, this is the most challenging part, because what happens is the chief ministers think that they have come with a mandate to do everything that is possible, or everything they would like to do. And officials also many a time believe that then this chief minister is telling me, then I have no choice but to do it. So it actually requires a strategic appreciation, and that is one big talent that I have learned in my international career, how to think from a strategic perspective, from a long-term perspective, rather than think from a narrow sectarian or sectoral point of view. From today is not about today, but also about tomorrow, also about 5 years later. How does this system operate? And I'll just take a half a minute to expand also on the direct cash transfers, because I piloted the original direct benefit transfers. I mean, because in 2012, when Aadhaar became the in thing and it had to be done, I had really driven Aadhaar. I was a coordinator also for Aadhaar implementation in Andhra Pradesh state, from the state counterpart, because you had the Aadhaar authority uh, and the UIDA, and we had the state government. So Andhra, by and large, I had ensured that everyone, we had, by the time the state divided, we already had about 96, 97% of the population who had enrolled. And later we took it to almost near 100, duly ensuring, usually traditionally, the poor and those remaining in excluded areas, the very elderly, the physically informed would be excluded. So we focused on that. The second was the direct transfers, first for the scholarships, then for the civil supplies on an experimental basis, and third, LPG was one of those earliest direct benefit transfers that we started and later extended to pensions. So this was the experimentation, and I do believe that it did help people in bypassing the system. But I mean, there are a number of other issues that we can talk about maybe later. So I'll stop at that.
Right. I mean, in fact, coming to some of the issues, sir, given political compulsions to sort of, announce welfare programs after one after the other, and that really having an impact in terms of efficiency as well. So, what should change in the system for, let's say, some of these things to happen, which is largely, there have been experiments in the past where there have been women-centric budgets, there have been, programs across multiple departments actually focusing on, a single beneficiary. But where is the real challenge and, what can, one do to address this, especially the political capital of it?
I mean, what happens ultimately? I mean, this the convergence of various programs, because uh, what happens in our country, but particularly in our country, and this is very unique to South Asia, because I mean, I consider this as a civilizational challenge, or because our mindset is very fragmented. If I am heading a health department, and in health, again, if I'm heading only the public health, and then medical education, somebody looks after, uh, I will never think about the entire healthcare. I mean, if I am a citizen, or you and I would like, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, we don't think in a departmental sense. So the biggest challenge, in my view, in our country is that we have departmentalized the communities. We have segmented them in such a way that integrated service delivery, or integrated delivery of whatever are the inputs that the public system is supposed to provide, uh, works at a very suboptimal level. So, I mean, we try to bring nutrition as the focus in Andhra when I was health secretary, and then later as a finance secretary, basically to see that education, particularly early childhood education, nutrition, that is Anganwadis, and the healthcare, immunization, antenatal care, intranatal care, iron supplementation. All these things are delivered in an integrated manner. We've set up at the village level the institutional mechanism, at the sub-center level, and at the PHC, and then at the community health center. I set up even the community health and nutrition clusters, where ICDS and the secondary hospital, they are co-located. Now, but what happens is these things are long gestation, and you need a sustained effort over a longer period of time in order for these institutions to survive and become integrated into the system. That, I believe, has not happened in many states. I mean, there have been ad hoc attempts, certainly lots of progress, but a lot more that needs to be done. In fact, one of the, I mean, if you look at the NFHS, the National Health and Family Survey, which has just come out, the NHFS 5, I mean, it shows that actually the undernutrition has not only not improved, but actually there's been a decline in the last 5 years. And I was looking at both Telangana and Andhra, and it is quite striking that that's despite all these efforts. I mean, one understands nutrition change is an intergenerational issue. It really, you need to invest in the girl child even when she is in the womb. So it takes a generation really to manifest in the change. Still, we have not been able to make the difference. Essentially, in my view, also is this service delivery integration. The institutions do not function, and to a large extent, I apportion this blame not to the political leadership, but to the civil servants. And because every civil servant thinks that they need to really leave their stamp. Many a time we forget we are merely instruments, mediators, messengers in the overall system. And then we form an important chain in the system. And every link is as important as the link that has come before us and link that would come after us. So, but we fail to perceive this. So consequently, we take a short-term view. The civil servants have an important role to play in configuring the strategic perspective and operationalizing that strategy. So we need to move from the scheme-based approach to more integrated, holistic, program-based, community-centered delivery system. And we've been talking about it ever since I joined the service 36 years ago, and we are still talking about the same thing.
Right. So, what would be some of the structural barriers to this? Again, there've been a lot of talk about decentralization of funds, devolution of funds. How can that really happen in practice, and what are some of the I mean, like you mentioned that we've been talking about this for the past, let's say, couple of decades or possibly more. How will this will this ever realize actually in practice, or or what should change for this to happen on ground?
I mean, I think what in a way is happening increasingly, and I can speak to you candidly and to your audience, is that the technology has enabled greater centralization instead of a greater decentralization of the governance. I think the trend that I see is a greater centralization because now the technology enables me, number one, to deliver money, let's say to 40 lakh families at the same time from a central point. I mean, I click of a button, I can deliver now, transfer money or cash. Now, this is both empowering and disempowering at the same time because it is centralized. And so I determine as a chief minister or a chief ministers these days really have become the sort of a centralizing authorities. So in that sense, both good can happen and bad can happen. And then it can disempower those functionaries at the lower level, because then I can start believing as a chief secretary or chief minister or secretary to the chief minister that I can do everything. There is no need for those functionaries out there. So, and then there is also a lack of ownership. Then the people at the bottom start believing that they don't have a role to play here, so they can withdraw. And since you are not concurrently empowering them in terms of really, delegating responsibility, delegating authority, holding them accountable, resourcing them, building their capacities. Now, I do believe, I mean, I, for one, as a strong believer that we need a mix of both centrality and decentralization. One cannot do without the other. The second is, I do believe that the system is so dynamic. The world is changing, the technology is evolving, people's expectations are changing. So, what is that? We need to be alive to this new realities in terms of technology, in terms of aspirations, in terms of the expectations of the people, and the volatile political and economic environment we are working in right now, particularly with the COVID. The world has changed. I mean, we yet to acknowledge the impact of COVID. I mean, we still seem to think that it's business as usual. So we need to reconfigure the institutional architecture, re-understand the role of the various departments that traditionally we have inherited. In a way, at the state level, notwithstanding modest efforts of people like me, who are lesser mortals, there's not been a serious effort to reorganize, reconfigure the bureaucratic system or the delivery system of what the public should be doing, the public institutions, what the private institutions must be doing, what the citizens must be doing. This configuration, we really have not, we still, in a way, I believe that we are still stuck in early 90s paradigm, where when the Washington consensus believed that the government should withdraw completely from all core services, you need a very small government. Instead of that, we continued with the large government, but with the same old skill set that is not suitable or that does not serve today's expectations.
Right. So, sir, I mean, when you talk about large government, I mean, there's also been talk about, the lack of frontline, let's say, capacity. I think most countries would possibly have about 10 to 12% of their, the workforce, on that front, whereas India has only 2 to 3% of public workforce. So again, on one hand, you have technology where, the state can feel that they could do much more just by pressing a button and sort of leave out the building the capacity frontline. It almost sort of it becomes a vicious circle. So, I mean, again, what can be done here and what are the challenges here?
But I think this is the biggest challenge in terms of the really reconfiguring at the delivery system level. Now, I mean, you look at now today the number of functionaries at the field level. The ASHA workers, for every 100 population everywhere. You have an Anganwadi worker. Then you have at the village level. And then in states like Andhra, you have these village secretariats everywhere in every village. And then, so there are fair-sized functionaries. The challenge is really how do you make use of them? What do they do? Or what is their skill set? How do they integrate with the community? And why is that we still have the challenges of malnutrition, high high communicable disease burden, non-communicable disease burden? I mean, look at the statistics. You have nearly one third of people above the age of 35 who have either diabetes or hypertension or both. Now, all this requires a much more uh, reconfiguration of the institutions, the way that we locate them, a stronger focus on what really needs to be delivered by the governments, what does not need to be delivered by the governments. Are we empowering the field level functionaries, or are we disempowering them? Today, what does a block development officer or a bundle development officer do? So these are some of those areas I think that they have not been addressed. They need to be addressed. More important is the politicization. I mean, I think nobody. This is the big elephant in the room, or the tiger in the room that nobody wants to talk about. Is the biggest issue really today is the overwhelming presence of the political system everywhere, and everything being politicized. And then we still live with the older version of the social architecture. We still have the caste hierarchies, we still have the social exclusion problems, we still have the gender disparities, we still have those people, girl children dropping out of school very early. We still have the Dalits and the Adivasis and the minorities who do not have equal access to services. So there is an intrinsic problem socially, politically. And so these two issues are further complicating the system. And the urban areas are posing a new challenges altogether, because we have not configured what is a sustainable urban living space. Slums are growing. Many of the slums are not even registered or recognized. So they are illegal tenements, illegal settlements, notwithstanding the fact so many house sites are being given. Service delivery in the urban areas, because you have the more and more poor gravitating to the urban areas. Particularly the COVID, in my view, has disproportionately impacted the urban poor. So the urban poverty is likely to deepen in the coming days. And there are no instruments, there are no institutions. Actually, the India does not have, other than in the metropolitan areas, a urban healthcare system. We simply have said that the private hospitals take care of them. But what about immunization? What about antenatal care? What about the preventive services, the promotional avenue? So these issues are needs a complete rethinking, in my view. And this is the time also to introduce an urban employment guarantee program, not mere giveaways, but really centered around creating livable urban spaces. So we look at service delivery, drinking water, a portable drinking water, a drainage management system, these housing, a livable housing spaces in the urban areas, and a proper access roads. So you make the urban living space not really unlivable, but really convert them into more places where you could be proud to be part of this. So this regenerative opportunity, I think, needs to be harnessed, which requires a completely new creative thinking at all levels: political, bureaucratic, social, people like you, those who think, those who act, and institutions like yours. I mean, really this dialogue between the political executive and the bureaucratic executive, it can't always be command and control. It has to be horizontal. So I believe that technology, instead of enabling us, is also disempowering to some extent. And similarly, I noticed the same thing with the financial management, which we set up, hoping that the centralization process would bring in greater transparency, greater accountability, and greater decentralization. But in actual practice, the converse has happened. So these are challenges. I think these challenges will continue to grow in the coming days as the fiscal space becomes smaller following COVID.
Right. So quick time check, sir. We have about 10 minutes. If there are any questions for sir, I mean, please do put them in chat. Sir, I mean, since we're talking about COVID and given these fiscal spaces like really shrunk, I mean, what do you think are some areas where the government could possibly like really sort of bring in more efficiency at this time, especially in the areas of health and education? Um, these are two areas, I mean, which have been impacted the most. I mean, education clearly is not the priority. Again, I mean, I know that in Andhra Pradesh, I think there's a news which is talking about, Amavadi scheme, the second phase of Amavadi, about 6,000 crores being, spent on about 40 lakh mothers. So what else could be done in this space, especially in health and education, given the constraints of this fiscal space?
Andhra perhaps is now experimenting, as I can say, with the large-scale cash transfers under different schemes, and one really has to see what is the level of impact. I mean, this is sort of stretching the boundaries of direct benefit transfers, cash transfers. Now, is this sustainable? Can the government fiscal system afford this? Because ultimately, you have only this much space, but our ambition is this much. Can we meet? That is a bigger challenge, number one. Number two is, does the cash translate into better quality of life? Or do I, if I have money, do I drink rather than use it, invest in nutrition for my children or education for my children? So I think we need to really now reconfigure the level of, and also because if they're unconditional cash transfers, then I don't have an obligation as a citizen to do anything at all. And then my dependence on government grows exponentially instead of the dependence getting down. So these are some of those issues that need to be addressed, not just in Andhra Pradesh or Telangana, but across the country, because these are issues across the board, because even Government of India in its new welfareist approach is adopting more and more of cash transfer as a solution. Now, then how do I, if I'm a poor person in a village, number one, am I getting excluded? I mean, I'm not bothered so much about a rich man taking away the benefits, but is the poorest of the poor, those who are traditionally socially excluded, the disempowered, the women, elderly, the advanced age, those who have physically challenged, are they being excluded? Is one issue that always bothers me. And it always happens that even if they have, usually they get excluded because technology perhaps ensures that they get excluded. The social system ensures they do get excluded. The second is even if they get cash, do they have access to services? So I believe this is the time the country must commit itself to education and healthcare as a universal entitlement, a quality education, healthcare, and nutrition. These three things, and the gender equality as a universal fundamental rights. And they must be explicitly incorporated in the Constitution as rights where every citizen can really claim as an entitlement. That's number one. Number two is, there's a time to clearly define that there's a growing inequities in the country. There's no level playing field. If I'm a poor man, I don't have an access to quality education. How do I ever catch up? And the reservations or scholarships is never a substitute for access to a level playing field in which every citizen, irrespective of birth, caste, community, religion, location, and the financial status, is able to access the best quality education. So this is time to really education, healthcare, and nutrition. These three fundamental rights, I think, need to be enshrined in the Constitution, and you need to build institutions if you have to ensure that there is an opportunity for social mobility for everyone. Today, I think South Asia particularly, and in general, and India particularly, there is no commitment that we don't bother that there is growing inequities in the society. Some people are becoming billionaires and some people are living where they were 100 years ago. And there is no effort really to level that. And we are simply saying, no, no, I'll give you 1,000 rupees, be happy with that, or I'll give you 10,000 if you shout and scream too loudly, and people stop doing that. So I think, and also what services need to be publicly provided. I think there are certain services that have to be publicly provisioned. Primary education for one, primary healthcare for the other, nutrition supplementation. These are to be accepted as public goods, and they have to be publicly provisioned, whatever is the budgetary requirements. Now, I mean, let me also stop and just take 1 second to also share a personal experience. I had, I mean, through political negotiations and other means, when I moved from in the finance department, because the chief minister was supporting, very supportive, we increased the budget. We doubled the budget for healthcare, because I came from the health department, and there everybody was, I used to struggle to get 1 rupee extra from the finance department. One professor post sanctioned, it used to be an impossible. So when I moved to finance, the first thing I did was, number one, no limits on your budget. Number two is, whoever is the staff that you need, provided that you demonstrate that they are required, it will be given. You can recruit, fill up all your posts. But what I realized was two things. One is that the departments are poorly equipped in order to absorb the additional money that you give. Number two is, people are so stuck in the traditional, uh, the hierarchy of staffing, that there is no thinking of what is my requirement, who do I require, and how do I optimize the utilization of my resources. So I even uh, we made some efforts, and I think I left it incomplete. There are 248 different categories of services functionaries in medical education department. 248 functionaries, different functionaries, and of which at least 180 of them not required. So, you need to reconfigure these issues fundamentally, and this is something which I believe, in my own limited way, I believe that they are not being addressed, or they are not being talked about, let alone being addressed.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. One final question. The last time we connected in December, I know you were preparing for your exam in law. So I just wanted again your motivation. Right from being a doctor to civil services. At the end of your career, I mean, you are giving examinations. And with this also, I mean, what would your advice be for any young budding aspirant? I mean, in terms of in this space of public policy and governance, what would your advice be?
I didn't get your question. I mean,
I mean, one
if you
was
can
like
just.
the motivation for actually taking up law at such a stage, because I found it very interesting when I last spoke. You mentioned that you had your exams actually coming up, which is why we couldn't do this in December. So, what's your motivation behind that? And second is, I mean, in terms of advice for people wanting to work in this space of public policy and governance, I mean, what would your advice be?
Yeah, I mean, as far as my motivation for law is concerned, I think it's fairly simple. I mean, I always wanted to study in my whole career. I mean, I wanted to go back and do doctoral studies or higher studies. I just simply couldn't get to do that. I mean, I was just about to go abroad to study, and then I got the international assignment, and it just went on and on. So it's just that I didn't have an opportunity to study, not because, I mean, I learned a lot. I mean, I perhaps have adequate knowledge on various other issues, but I thought it just challenges you in a way to a structured examination. Number one, challenges you to be disciplined, spend specific hours of time. And when you write an exam, the retrieval is becomes so important. Your memory repository processing of that. So to those are some of those connections in the brain that become dysfunctional as people grow older, and that is why one has dementia and others. So these are those, you challenge those intellectual resources to revive and rejuvenate and rework. So that's one of the way that you challenge yourself in a fundamental way. Writing an exam is completely different from reading a book for the sake of having a knowledge. So because you have a limited time, it's very structured. You have to write your exam. So I mean that is one. I mean that's one challenge. But the large important issue I always felt is the litigation is so high and so expensive. If I'm an ordinary poor person fighting for the rights, there is no way that I can afford the fee of the lawyers. So my dream really is that after 3 4 years, that I would just full time be a lawyer, practice human rights and the rights base. I mean, wherever there's a fundamental rights violated, I want to support people. But unfortunately, because of COVID, I couldn't write the second semester exams, because when I went to write the exam, I found that everybody is young person. I mean, they're everybody in 20s, and here me at the old fool coming and writing, and I didn't want to contract COVID with 30 people in the room. So I'm yet to write my second semester, so I'm just still at the very beginning. Second is those career in public policy or public service. I mean, I still believe that there is a great opportunity for a public service. And also, I mean, a great opportunity actually more to be a public policy practitioner with outside the government. And also being in both ways it works. But I also believe that perhaps things will improve. But when I look back at 85 and 2021, I do believe the civil services, in terms of their competence, their commitment to public importance, their integrity, I think have declined disproportionately and at a much faster pace than I would have believed. So I would like to advise that if one is strongly committed, one can still find a space, but that space is very limited. I mean, the work that I did 30 years ago, I cannot do now, even fraction of that, let alone all of it. I cannot do even a fraction of it, because we have ceded ourselves, civil servants have ceded this space, and that space is increasingly occupied by the political establishment and the private sector. And that level of, I mean, I'm also reminded of this the very interesting article by Professor Tony Judd, who's passed away, who used to write on the public policy and particularly of Europe, and the professor of NYU. He says the problem is, I mean, his students, I mean, he was writing this about 10 years ago before he died. And he was saying his students ask him the question, uh, I mean, I mean, when he asked them, I mean, what is the purpose of your life? I mean, what do you want to do? They used to tell him that, you guys, he's certainly about 10, 20 years older than me. Say, you guys had it easy because you had a cause to fight for. This is talking about the Western, but very much applies to us. I mean, in a way that what cause do you fight for? Of course, I mean, we have many causes now. I think that's why I'm saying there is always a circular progression of history. Maybe I think the young people who want to join the civil services, I think it's still financially it's reasonable. I mean, you're middle class. You can't expect to be rich unless you corrupt. You're middle class, so but it's a comfortable life. You certainly have a lot of authority still. If you just want to order around, yes, it's a great service. If you want to be a servant, then I mean, really render public service, then it's a hard work. One has to learn, one has to read, one has to listen, and so one has to dirty oneself.
Right. With that, I mean, thank you so much, sir, for taking time out. It was a pleasure listening to you. I think a lot of learning for all of us. And I wish you luck with your, venture on law. I hope we see you as a lawyer and as an activist. So thank you once again for taking time out.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really grateful. I mean, this is a great conversation. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity and opportunity to interact with you, share my thoughts. I hope I have not gone overboard or I've been useful in what I have said. I've been candid. And thank you so much. And I wish you all the best and keep up with your good work and look forward to meeting you and your colleagues and Tarun sometime soon,
Sure.
physically.
Yeah, absolutely.
All
Thank
the
you so
best.
much. Wish you luck. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, everyone.